Great. So maybe we'll get started. We'll probably have some other people joining, but we're super glad to have all of you here. I'm Linda Norris. I'm Senior Specialist for Methodology and Practice at the Coalition. Again, we're so glad to have you all here. If you want, and please introduce yourself in the chat room, that would be great. So we can learn a little bit about who we are. Next slide, Angie, if you would. Also joining me on the call is Angie Williams from our communications department, I should say. Some of you are members of the coalition. Some of you are regular webinar attenders. But if you're new to the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, if somehow you follow the hashtag failure and it appeared in your Twitter feed or however else, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the coalition before we began. We are the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, and we are the only global network that works with museums, historic sites, and memory initiatives around the world to create a more just future. We use the tools of the past in every kind of way. We have members, our more than 300 members are in 65 countries. They deal with everything from secret police archives in Guatemala to thinking about immigration at the Angel Island Immigration Station. All over the world, people come together to use the tools of the past for a more just future. So, if you are interested in the coalition and you think your organization might want to be a member, please be in touch with us. We're really easy to find. Our website is sitesofconscience.org. We also do lots of training and consulting. So there's that other part that we'd be happy to talk to you about as well. If you have thoughts, questions, whatever, please put it in the chat box as we go along. This is technically one of our webinar shorts, so it'll be about 45 minutes to give you time for a break before your next meeting. One of the nicest things that we've heard from so many of you who take the webinar survey is that you really appreciate the chance to meet other people on these webinars, which is a little bit different. So what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to do this. We're going to go into breakout rooms first thing. We're going to talk about failure a lot in this webinar and about fears, but I want to start with each of you introducing yourself in breakout rooms to talk about what's giving you joy this week, because I bet something is giving you joy. To me, I'm somewhere different than I usually am, and the lilacs are out. So I'm gonna break you into breakout rooms, and it's a lightning round, so be fast. And you're gonna introduce yourself to the other people in the room and say one thing that is giving you joy this week. Everybody good? Got those instructions? All right, here go breakout rooms. So next slide, Angie. Failure. It's really scary. And I think particularly now, right, there are so many worries these days. Professional worries, personal worry, professional in terms of our career and what has happened, personal worries, how are our kids managing going to school from home, all kinds of things, and organizational. But today we're really going to try and talk about some solutions to address not organizational failure, but the fear of failure and how to take some actions that begin to mitigate how that might happen. But I think I want to hear from all of you about what those fears are. So here in the chat room is a Padlet. Click on that link and it takes you to a Padlet page, and you can add anonymously your biggest organizational fear. Because let's start, so what you're going to do is click on the little round circle with the plus sign at the bottom right, and a text box pops up. And you're just going to be able to start adding. I'd like all of you to add the things that, oh, wow, people are totally at it already. You know what the fears are. We have lots of them, right? This is making headlines for racism, stagnation, not being able to connect, getting conversations wrong about race, not serving community needs, that we continue to uphold the status quo. These are great. And obviously, I can see that there's a lot of fear because all of you, these are going fast. I can't say, I would love to tell you that we can fix all those in these 30 minutes. I don't think we can. But what I hope we can do is really think about what kind of strategies we can use to manage them. And I will say a number of you had comments about conversations about race and about challenging conversations in terms of those changes. I do want to suggest there are lots of great other webinars on our website that deal with some of those issues quite specifically. So I want to suggest you check those out as well. But really quickly, next slide, Angie. Making change is a creative process. And it's really important to understand that creativity is a practice. We're all born creative. We all find creative solutions, no matter what job we work at in an institution. It's really helpful to understand that it is a practice. So one, it requires practice. It's like riding a bike, but also that there are stages to it. So I'm really quickly going to go through these so you can think about it as you begin to say, oh, but how are we going to put our creative oomph as an organization to solving these things that are just scaring the pants off of us? So the first one is preparation. You talk to people, you listen, you read things, you connect with your colleagues, all those kinds of things. Second is incubation. We all need time. And I have to say, this is hard. And I feel like it's become harder in our Zoom lives to think about things. Whether you think about it when you take a walk, whether you become really great at ending your meetings at 15 minutes before the hour, so you can take 15 minutes to think about things, all those kinds of things. You need the time to incubate. Insight is when it's like what we think of when someone says creativity and ideas, right? It's the light bulb part, when an idea comes into your head. But the light bulb part doesn't work unless you've done those other parts. Evaluation is both internal. Will this work? You know, we all do that in our heads ourselves, but then you also begin to share it out with broader groups of colleagues. And then implementation. And to be honest, this is always a circular process, because when you implement, then you begin to say, maybe I need to know more, or I could do this differently. But having people on a team understand this process is always really helpful. And it begins to lessen a little bit of the fear. Next slide, Angie. So I do want to say mistakes are good. And then I realized how old I am that I used the image of whiteout. Sorry, everyone. And I feel sure everyone knows, because I play trivia, that the inventor of whiteout was one of the monkey's mothers. So just sharing that totally random trivia fact with all of you. Mistakes are good. Fear of failure often paralyzes us away from actually taking action. But mistakes, whiteout was invented as a mistake and to correct mistakes, but also the Thomas Edison story when someone said, wow, you had to try 500 different things for filaments to light bulbs. How did you feel about failing 500 times? And Thomas Edison said, I learned 500 things. And so embracing the idea that there are going to be mistakes, that you own up to them in honest and transparent ways, but you're going to learn something from every one of them. Next slide. So I think part of that is really embracing. Okay, Susan, I know, I'm sorry. Do they not even know who the monkeys are? Now I feel super old, Susan. Part of this is that we become so paralyzed about failure because it's uncomfortable, because it's risky, because we have to be vulnerable. And that's scary. That's what leads, I think, often institutions to make these kind of performative apologies that don't really do something, and then it's worse because they didn't really do the work. I think that institutions that embrace discomfort, that allow their staff to be vulnerable, that take risks are going to do better. And by the way, I want to say this is for everyone. And I believe a leader's job at any institution is to build a culture about this. So wherever you are in an institution, you can model this, but this support of thinking about these tough issues and as a part of, understanding failure and overcoming it is really, really importantly a leader's job. Next slide. So another way to think about that, to push it a little further, is that we need to be continuously reflecting on our privilege, our practice, our perspectives. There's a editorial appeared last week by the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, who essentially took his fellow museum colleagues to task for thinking about, whether, for instance, the Benin bronzes should be returned. He's like, no, we don't need to think about that. That is a guy who could not reflect on his organization's practice, perspective, and privilege, right? So Mary Liz, I think it's so interesting that we value our historic heroes, right? We like them because we're successful. I'm trying to think about if there's like a museum about a really failed hero. That's a great, Mary Liz, that's a great comment. Really interesting that in some ways our institutions are embedded with this like success.
Yeah.
Right. That's a great point. Thanks.
Yeah.
But we need to think about it all the time. And I think the other thing I would add to this is that our own organization's history is also a part of what we need to be reflected on. Some of you are from new organizations, but many of you are from longer standing organizations. And to be honest, many, if not most of them, all of them, have participated in systems of systemic racism and exclusion, whether it's in your collections, whether it's on your board of trustees. This continuous reflection and then action, because reflection is never enough, and then action is what's going to begin to say, okay, we can do this because we have honestly looked at ourselves. Next slide, Andy. So a couple ways to kind of begin to think about what action might be like as you begin to think about it. As an organization, increase the flow of new, interesting, varied information, experiences, and inspiration. This could be anything, right? How has a local small business, what have they done to keep their customers engaged? How's a museum somewhere else in the world approach income generation, which I know everyone's going to be thinking, the failure part is there. How are parks engaging visitors in their outdoor spaces in ways we are not? How are museums, what's inspiring you in museum things you see around the world? So really begin to look in places you might not always look for inspiration. And I know, to be honest, for me, I feel like the flood of new things I would love to be thinking about is huge. It's like a fire hose right now. But begin to look, all of you are at this webinar because you wanted to learn something new. You wanted to meet some new people. You wanted to think about things in different ways. So continue to do this, but increase that flow. And then also think about ways that in your organization, you can share all the new things you're learning and thinking about. So, so that it becomes kind of a collective flow of information. And I think that you'll begin to see some solutions. And to be honest, we also have all discovered that we're all in the same boat here, right? That has been, in a way, the lesson the pandemic has taught us, is that we've all been in lockdown. Our institutions have been hugely affected. So there are answers in different places, and we can find them by learning from each other. Next slide, Angie. So understand and set creative constraints. I think this is my great example at the moment. I always have different slides I use for different things. Is about quilters who always work in constraints. So all three of these quilters, for instance, have made a star quilt. I think they're called Texas stars. But look at how different they are. And that, when we begin to think about the failure, part of what happens is we're like, the failure is a giant thing, right? It's this like big, horrible, like, it's like the worst dust ball under your couch you could imagine. But if you say, okay, but here, I'll use an example. The Anacostia Community Museum in DC was supposed to take they're an arm of the Smithsonian, but they were supposed to take one of the sites exhibits last year and have it inside. But of course they weren't open, so they couldn't do inside. So the big kind of giant dust ball was like, what are we gonna do about this exhibit? But they put a constraint that said, how are we gonna do this exhibit outside? And then did an amazing exhibit outside. So think about how you can frame your, put a constraint on whatever it is. How are we going to open? How are we going to, how are we going to begin to have those conversations around race? Frame it in a smaller way and work within those constraints to begin. Next slide. So sorry, I wanted to go back. I was not paying enough attention to the chat room. Matthew, I think losing support since our society places so much value on success. That's a great point. And I think, right, I feel like there's an opportunity now for us to begin to rethink success a little bit. And I think that's a really great point, Matthew, and that we need to, I have to say, because I come from a small museum background, I've done more than my share of programs where 10 people came, and I was like, but the topic was so great, and 10 people came. And, and then it's like, is that a failure, or did 10 people get something really important? So I think it's really important that we make our case, that we think about impact versus outcomes. Impact is the change we make. Outcome is, did we have 50 or 100 people? We need to think about both, but the museum field, I think, and history museums, the whole part, when I say museums, I mean the whole realm of things. I think people, we've just been too willing to think that we have to be successful, and then how can we frame it? So think about the impact and think about ways to articulate that impact. We've been working on a project here at the Coalition with a group of our member sites, and really working on logic models as a tool to think about that, which I highly recommend. This shift your perspective on your coworkers, I think, is a critical part of overcoming these fears of failure. One, I think, and I did a project a long time ago, and now I learned it once and do it more often now, where we started in a reinterpretation project, and I was a consultant, and we kind of started down, and we were all really excited, our little team, but then we got partway through, and it was clear that there were deep fears among other people at the institution. And we actually had a meeting, and we're like, okay, everyone tell us what they're the most scared of about this project. And they were scared about losing audience. They were scared about losing support. And so I think, but once those fears are out on the table, we could shift our perspective a little bit. And I have to say, this year, we've learned a lot more about our coworkers than we ever thought we would know. We know their pets, we know their kids, we know what their rooms look like. It's a chance to really think that all of your coworkers bring something to the table. There's something about appreciating coworkers, I think, that's really important in overcoming those fear of failures. And Lindsay, your comment, that fear of being laid off, which is so real and has been real for something like a huge percentage of museum workers this year. If it fails, it's your fault. It's a success, a shared success. I think there's something to be done in the reframing of those things so that both things are shared. So when my Rainey Tisdale and I wrote the book Creativity and Museum Practice, we came across kind of a business school quote that said, reward success and failure, punish inaction. And I think that's a great lesson, but we have to do it collectively. None of us are successful at our institutions on our own. None of us fail on our own. That is absolutely true. Next slide. So reframe, this kind of gets to that a little bit about failing and successes and not successes. Reframe your projects as experiments and set expectations accordingly, right? Often we're going to do something really big and then it like doesn't succeed because you made it sound really big, kind of oversold it. But if you say, oh, we're just going to try this. And this is an example from a Sites of Conscience, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Connecticut, who I worked with before I joined the coalition on this reinterpretation project. And we had this idea, we had done some visitor survey and we found out that what people wanted to do in the house, which had had a really traditional historic house tour, was to read, Harriet Beecher Stowe's an author, and sit down, which might be what everyone wants in every historic house ever. And so we were like, so let's try it. And people were like, no, people aren't going to do that. We can't do that. And so the very first day, this is from the very first day we tried it, probably like 8 years ago at this point. The table you see in the center is 2 cardboard boxes with a tablecloth. And we were that dedicated to experimenting. And they sat in her parlor and discussed, current events, newspaper articles, runaway slave ads, all kinds of literature from the 1850s when she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was amazing. I still remember that day because we were like, we're just going to try it with people who come today. That was our only commitment. If it failed, we only wasted a day. We didn't we didn't announce it publicly. We didn't do anything. It was an experiment. And then, particularly the guides were really hesitant about this, right? They're like, I don't know. So I facilitated this first conversation because it was easier than trying to convince someone else to it. But it really made that experiment. We could say, look, here's what we learned. Here's how we're going to build going forward. But the expectation of huge success, first thing out of the gate, was not there. So we managed that expectation. And I think that's, as we begin to reopen, that's really important that we manage those expectations. Next slide. And I have to say, keep putting stuff in the chat room. Oh, sorry, I did not think we were that far yet. Can you back up? Sorry. So I'm going to put you into small groups. Well, first I'm going to ask if any of you have other kind of specific questions. Anybody? And feel free to unmute yourself as well. Angie, you could stop sharing the screen even so I can see more people.
Linda?
Yeah.
Mary Liz here.
Yeah,
I was just
sure,
wondering, I was very curious about the experiment that you just described. Did that get implemented as ongoing experience opportunities for visitors?
Absolutely. You can go visit the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center now and take a tour that includes that. There's the cardboard box is gone, but yeah. But we actually did a lot of iterations of it. But yes, it did get implemented.
Very, very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. Are there, Allie, useful resources about moving from a tour-based to a discussion-based model? There are some, I'm trying to think about our webinars, about what we have. And I believe there are some our resource center is members only, I will say, but we've done a fair amount of kind of training and discussion about moving to a more discussion-based, a dialogic model as we kind of talk about it. And I think you might try taking a look, you can see on our website if you're not a member, our front page dialogues, which are dialogues that respond to kind of immediate issues and are framed within the arc of dialogue framework. So that might be an interesting place to kind of start. It's, we probably at Harriet Beecher Stowe piloted on and off for 2 years. You know, like we would change things, we would have a new idea. I think it's really useful to think that whatever you're producing is not a final product. Because the goal of a discussion-based model, right, is that the experience is different every time for visitors. So other questions, observations, anybody? Allie, I'll follow up with you. Yay, yes, and I'll follow up with you. Questions, thoughts? Now so what I'm gonna do, I really think framing things as experiments is really important. And I do wanna say, I know many of your concerns and your fears were particularly around acknowledging questions about relevancy and obsolete, you know, being accused of racist practices, all those kinds of things, those, right, are really important. So think those are hard things. And I do want to say that a critical part of any of those hard things, which is not really the subject of this webinar, is really engaging with the communities whose stories that you're looking to tell, the people who've been left out of the stories at your museum or historic house. That is not the work of 5 minutes. That's long-term work. So I do want to suggest that as you do your experiments, you do it in collaboration and partnership with people. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take a couple minutes and put you in small groups again and share a little bit. If you can think of, you've got your fear of failure in your head, think of a small experiment that you could do to begin overcoming that change. So I'm going to put you in small groups. You're going to talk about kind of, oh, what could I experiment with? Okay, we're sending you all to breakout rooms. You're talking about a small experiment you could do to address the thing that you're afraid of. Got it? We'll give you a couple minutes and then come back. Everybody's back. So who wants to share an experiment they heard about? Not the one you're going to do, the one someone else shared. Anyone have one to share?
Well, someone in our group, Sarah, was mentioning the idea of if you're of framing an exhibit with the sort of the idea right out there that this is an experiment, or that we're having a discussion, or something that tells the visitor, the participant, that they are part of this experiment. So they don't come into it expecting it's a finished project either.
Great. That's a great idea. Actually, I saw a great exhibit a year ago, or a year, probably more than a year, because it was when I actually went anywhere, at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, that was working on an exhibition about the Dutch and the history of the slave trade. And it was, the labels were very, and the whole design was very, very clear that it was an experiment, that it was a first phase to kind of think about and learn more. Other experiments people thought about, heard about, had ideas, your own or whatever.
In the breakout room I was in with Brett and Shannon and Mary and Barbara, I think I got everybody. We did address the experimentation that has come through the need to go virtual, and the challenges that have confronted us in that style. Although we seemed to be in agreement that post-pandemic there will be a serious consideration of ways to continue the virtual. So while there have been challenges, there also have been, positive outcomes with that format.
Great. And that's a great example of, right, the kind of, right, when we all shut down, it was like, what's going to happen? And no one's going to be interested in us. And it's like, now people are kind of interested in us still in a different way. Great kind of idea. Anybody else have an experiment they want to share? So Angie, can you put up the last slide? And any other questions you have? This has been a super fast race through trying to overcome failure. And I realize that not every solution, but however, I will say many of you were thinking with the questions about racism and how we deal with them in our organizations. And we have an upcoming webinar, so I want to recommend that to all of you. But anybody else have other questions or concerns that I didn't get to, or I went over too fast? Also entirely possible. Thoughts, anybody?
Linda?
Like how much I totally appreciate that everyone feels so familiar that they're like, Linda?
Linda, if you don't mind putting in your chat, you mentioned a book and I didn't catch your title. So if you don't mind putting it
Oh,
in.
sure, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, did somebody else have another question besides that?
Linda, I have Mary Liz here again.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask, the slides that you shared in this presentation today, are they available after the fact? Because I'm thinking about, I need time to ruminate and, think through things that you suggested through that I would be reminded of through the PowerPoint. So that's why I was wondering if it's available after the fact.
So we post the webinar recording usually within a couple days, because so all our webinars are always on the website. And we have discovered, which is an interesting lesson for all of you who are doing webinars or content of different types. So many people, far more people actually watch webinars after the fact than actually come. Just interesting learning. So they're always there for you. For anybody, members and non-members, they're all there on our website. You can pull down a tab and see webinar recordings, and you can watch webinars to your heart's content.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And oh yes, thanks for putting the recording link in. Luann, I'm glad the webinar was useful. Any other final thoughts? Anything like that? So what we are going to put in the chat room, I think Angie's going to put it in the chat room, or maybe Ashley, is a link to our evaluation survey. They're short, it's super short, but it's so helpful if each of you could take 5 minutes and just fill it out for us. It helps us, helps us make a case for people who support our work. It helps us think about how to be better at our job and not fail as well. And it helps us think about new content for webinars. So please take a minute and take a watch. As always, feel free to reach out to me or anybody else at the coalition, but I'll give you my email address here, which I'll attempt to spell right. If you have questions about membership, about the training and consulting we do, about different kinds of resources, please feel free to send me an email. So with that, everybody, thank you so much for coming and have a great Wednesday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.